Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to the Department of Consumer Affairs weekly webinar. What we want to start out today is a topic talking about pre-need funeral contract basics. I'm Ken Middlebrooks, and I'm the Chief Investigator. Also, Joni Green is the Deputy Chief Investigator, and we're going to split this presentation. I'm going to start out talking about several areas of this topic, and then Joni will join in and discuss other areas. I've been with the department since 2000. So I've been chief investigator since 2010. And I believe, Joni, you've been with the department since
2006.
2006, and she's been deputy chief investigator for a number of years. So we've dealt with the pre-need law ever since it came over to the department. So what is a pre-need funeral contract? Well, it's an arrangement where you pay for your funeral products and services in advance. And the key thing of why it's a pre-need is the key word there is pay in advance. Why purchase a pre-need funeral contract? Well, there's pros and cons. The pros, you may lock into today's prices. That's one option. Peace of mind. And also Medicaid spend downs. There's an area for that when it comes to, and I'll discuss more of how that works. The cons of purchasing a pre-need contract is irrevocable contracts cannot be canceled after 30 days. Also can only transfer a contract to other licensed providers that have a pre-need license. So that's an area that some people don't understand when they go to transfer, is it can only go to another funeral home that has a pre-need license. And just to break out kind of the ratio there, there's about 600 licensed funeral homes in the state. And we've always had about half or a little over half that have held the entities held a pre-need license. You may not be able to get the funds if needed for other expenses in the future. All right, pre-need contract versus pre-arrangement. I touched on a little bit earlier what constitutes as a pre-need, and that was pay in advance. So a pre-need contract, you select and you pay for services and merchandise. You use, and the funeral home is required to use a state contract, which is then there's a filing fee and it's filed with the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. Also, the funeral home, the entity, the funeral home itself must be licensed to sell pre-need contracts. So what's a pre-arrangement? Pre-arrangement is where anyone can go in and they can select services and merchandise. They may leave actually private insurance paperwork where they have a life insurance and they want to leave that where part of their life insurance will pay at time of death, and they can leave that with the funeral director. They do not, on a pre-arrangement, use a state contract, and provides wishes for family to use as a guide at time of need. So it's a common practice where they want to go in and just go ahead and state their arrangements, but there's no money that changes hands. So the types of pre-need contracts, you have a guaranteed price pre-need contract. What that does is exactly what it says. It locks into today's price for future goods and services. Also, those monies must be deposited into an interest-bearing trust account or a pre-need insurance policy. The interest is used to offset inflation. And at time of need, funeral home keeps all the proceeds from the account or policy. So there's no money that's returned back if all services and products are provided. Family not responsible for additional payment for items, strictly items and services that are covered by the pre-need funeral contract. Types of pre-need contracts. Again, we talked about the guaranteed price. The other type that you can get is a non-guaranteed price. This particular type of contract, it sets aside money to be used at time of need. It does not lock into today's prices. So as prices go up, also that amount for the funeral would go up as well for a non-guaranteed pre-need contract. Services to be selected at time of need can offer flexibility with goods and services selected. So that's a notation that actually can be put on a non-guaranteed price contract. It's often used when consumers make payments and cannot prepay the entire amount of the contract. So you'll find where funeral homes where in the purchaser comes in and they can't make full price of the contract, and they have to make payments, that they will be written in a non-guaranteed price contract. And finally, if there are funds remaining under this type of contract after goods and services have been paid to the funeral home, then funds are refunded to the purchaser or to the estate of the beneficiary. All right. Also, under the types of pre-need contracts, another part of that contract is whether it's revocable or irrevocable. So under a revocable contract, the contract can be revoked or canceled at any time with written request. So hence the word revocable, then it can be revoked. Consumers can get funds back if needed under this type of contract. And it does not place funds outside of consumers' assets. So it's not helpful when it comes to Medicaid spend downs. It's still considered an asset and it's not set aside. The other is the opposite. It's an irrevocable contract. What's the things that evolve under an irrevocable contract? The contract does have a 30-day review period in which it can be revoked or canceled, but that's only up to 30 days. After the 30 days, the contract becomes irrevocable and the funds cannot be released until the time of death. And we get calls every now and again that something's happened economically in their household and they are trying to get their money back on the pre-need, but the problem is they have entered into an irrevocable contract, and so they cannot get that money back. Also, the final thing under an irrevocable contract is it places funds outside of a person's assets, and it is helpful for Medicaid spend down. So it's now then, once you enter into that, it's not considered an asset, and that's what that category means. So as we've gone through that information, which is really the breakdown of the types of contracts, does anyone have any questions yet? And I'll let Scott monitor that real quick and see if any questions have arisen yet.
We've not had any come in yet at this point.
All right, great. Well, we'll keep moving on. A lot of information. I'm going to now turn that over, this next portion over to Joni Green.
Hey everybody, my name is Joni Green, and like Ken said, I'm the Deputy Chief Investigator here at the Department of Consumer Affairs, and I've been here since 2006 when the department took over the regulation of the pre-need funeral contracts. So I kind of came in with pre-need, so it was one of the first industries I learned, and I still kind of feel a little some type of way with the funeral homes. I really enjoy dealing with the funeral directors. So I've got some frequently asked questions that we hear a lot from consumers and from the industry and stuff. We just thought this would be helpful to go over some of this. It might be questions you also have. So the first question we get a lot is who can sell pre-need contracts? And basically any licensed funeral director in the state that works for a funeral home that is licensed to sell pre-need can sell pre-need contracts. To become licensed, the funeral home must go through an application process with our department and be approved. And then they have to actually go through a renewal every 2 years. So, you know, if you work at ABC Funeral Home, if a funeral director works there and ABC is licensed to sell pre-need, then that funeral director can as well. There is a complete list of funeral homes on our website. If you go on to consumer.sc.gov and look under licensee lookup, it will show all of the currently licensed funeral homes in our state. So if this is something you're thinking about doing, you might want to go on there and see who in your area is licensed, and that way you know who you should be talking to about a pre-need contract. One question we do get a lot is, you know, what happens if I move? What happens if the circumstances of my life changes, but I've already entered into an irrevocable contract? What happens then? Well, for revocable, obviously, you can just revoke and cancel the contract. But for irrevocable contracts, you have a couple options. You can transfer the pre-need contract to another licensed provider. So if you say live on the coast and you move up toward the upstate, that pre-need contract can be transferred from the funeral home you dealt with at the coast. You can move it up to another licensed funeral home in the upstate. So you can simply move it. If you have a complete change of heart where maybe now you're not planning to have a traditional funeral, those funds can just sit in the contract, in the account, until you pass. And then the money will either be refunded to the purchaser or to your estate if you purchase the pre-need contract for yourself. This comes up occasionally. One time we had a lady that decided to donate her body to science, to the medical university down in Charleston. And so what happened, she'd already set up the pre-need. It had been past 30 days. And that money just sat there until she passed away. And then once she passed, it was refunded back to her estate, and then probate took over. The money is not going to be automatically released to a spouse, a child, a cousin. It does go back to your estate if you purchase it for yourself. If you purchase, say, for your mom and you're the purchaser, and then when she passes, it does come back to you because you were the purchaser. But if you purchase the pre-need for yourself, then it would go back to your estate. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's not necessarily going to go to a child. It would have to go through probate. We do get questions sometimes. It'll come up on the news that a funeral home has made headlines because they've taken money that was set aside, supposed to be set aside for pre-need. And we get, phone calls from consumers that are worried about how secure their money is. So one thing that you can have a little peace of mind with is that we routinely inspect funeral homes that sell pre-need. We are required to go in at least once every 2 years and audit the books and records. So we have a pretty good oversight on the funeral homes that sell pre-need contracts. All of the contracts that are sold are reported to us, so we have a list. So we know where the money's supposed to be, how much is supposed to be in the account number. We have all that information here. So we do keep tabs on all that. The trust accounts that the money is placed into, or the insurance policies that are purchased, they are not supposed to be accessed without a death certificate. So you shouldn't have to worry about the funeral director just going to the bank and closing the account. He would need your death certificate to access that money. So there's a layer of protection there. Licensed pre-need providers also have a surety bond as an extra layer of protection. So not only do we have oversight with the funeral contracts, but the funeral homes themselves are licensed through us, and then they also have a surety bond that also adds another layer of protection. The department also has a loss reimbursement fund that on the occasion that something, for some reason, the monies are not properly handled, we do have a fund that family members could file a claim against and be reimbursed for the money that has been lost. So occasionally it will happen that maybe a funeral director goes out of business, or perhaps they pass away, and the money was paid to that funeral director, and for whatever reason, he hadn't made it to the bank yet. It's still in his desk or whatever. But for whatever reason, we can't find where the consumer paid for the pre-need contract. And in those occasions, if we can't go against the surety bond to get that money back, the state does have a loss reimbursement fund. So your money is not going to just be lost. We will be able to make you back whole for the amount that you paid in. Another question that we get sometimes is that, if I purchase an irrevocable guarantee price contract, does the funeral home have to honor my wishes? Is this a guarantee that I'm going to get this funeral? So when a person dies, the next of kin becomes the decision maker for the deceased. And the next of kin does not necessarily have to use the pre-need funeral contract that you signed with the funeral home. At that point, you're no longer alive. Your next of kin's making the decision, so it's up to them. They can elect to use a different funeral home or even alter the plans. If they decide maybe you had paid for a cremation, but they want to do a more traditional funeral with a burial, what they could do is they could use the monies from the cremation and they could apply it toward the traditional burial. If there's money that is still owed, they would be responsible for that. If there's money owed back to you, if you had paid more than the services that you end up using, then that goes back to your estate if you purchased it, or back to the purchaser. So if you want to make sure that your final plans are honored and that you do not end up with a service that you don't plan for, you should probably speak with an attorney. But this pre-need contract itself does not guarantee that that's what's going to happen to you. It does become a next of kin decision at that point. So this in itself, the pre-need contract in itself, will not guarantee that you get exactly what's on that contract. All it guarantees is that if your next of kin chooses to have this service, it will cost this amount if it's a guaranteed price, and they will not be responsible for any additional payments. What happens if there are items on the pre-need contract that the family ends up not being able to use? So this was a question that came up a lot during COVID. People would have maybe a visitation or a traditional funeral on the contract, and for whatever reason, you were not able to have that service. And in those cases, there are a couple options. The funeral home can either refund that amount for, say, the visitation that was not used back to the purchaser or back to your estate, or they could use those funds for some other type of goods or service. So maybe a different casket spray, perhaps you could use it for a dress or something like that. So yeah, here's our example. If you couldn't use the visitation, maybe you would upgrade the casket. You could use it for whatever options, whatever merchandise they may have, or it could just be refunded back to the estate if you purchased it for yourself, or back to the purchaser if you purchased it for someone else. Some helpful tips. These are things just to keep in mind. If you're going to use a private insurance policy to fund your pre-need contract, give the funeral home a copy of the policy, but also keep a copy for your records. Funeral homes, we've had instances where either they go out of business, or maybe they have an employee that is not good at filing stuff and things get mixed up, or there was an emergency, there was a fire or a flood or something at the funeral home. But entrusting them with all the copies is not the best idea, because they have things happen too. So make sure you have a copy of everything that you give them. Make sure you have a copy of it as well. If you do purchase a pre-need contract, make sure that you keep a copy in a safe place, and you give a copy to a trusted family member or friend. Again, we have this quite often, that people will call and say, hey, I know that mom had prepaid for her funeral at ABC Funeral Home, but we don't have any idea. She did it herself. She paid for it herself. We don't know what it is. Can you help us? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. So it's important for you to have a copy at your house with your papers and important information, but also give a copy to maybe your next of kin, so they also know what you've paid for and what they should expect at time of need. Another tip that we just wanted to mention was that if a funeral home uses a trust account for your pre-need contract, you are responsible for paying the taxes on the interest that accrues during the year. So be on the lookout for a tax notice at the end of the year. Don't be surprised if you get that. Trust accounts are not gaining a ton of interest these days, but there is still a small amount that grows, and the purchaser is responsible for paying taxes on that. So you may get a tax notice from the bank. Funeral homes cannot charge inflation-proof or lock-in fees. So if they're guaranteeing the price, it has to just be whatever price that they're charging to everybody else at the time that you sign up for the pre-need contract. The services and the merchandise should be itemized either on the pre-need contract or on an attached statement of goods and services. So you should see what everything is costing you. You should have a breakdown. And all funeral homes are also required to provide a general price list. So make sure you get a copy of that general price list when you are when you're getting your pre-need contract, and make sure that the prices match and that they're not charging you more for something than they're charging current customers, thinking that it might be a while before you would need the contract. So the whole point of doing the guaranteed price is that you lock in today's price. So just make sure that you are paying today's prices for stuff. Okay, so we have another opportunity here for some questions if anybody has any. I don't know, Scott, if you see anything on the chat.
Yeah, we have somebody who asked, they say, I always assumed the non-guaranteed contract was for insurance policy only.
Not necessarily. We do have some funeral homes that will use the non-guaranteed price contract for a couple reasons. One, they may use it for cash advance items. So things that the funeral home cannot control the price of, they may use a non-guaranteed price contract. An example would be an obituary. The funeral home doesn't control what newspapers charge for obituaries. So basically what they may do is they say, hey, today the obituary that you would want would be $300. We'll write a non-guaranteed price contract for your obituary. We'll put $300 on there. That, you know, it'll gain interest and stuff as the account is open. But when you pass, with newspapers the way they are today, a $300 obituary today may be $500 then. So because they can't control how much that obituary changes, they might not feel comfortable guaranteeing a price on something like that. So they would just set aside some money that you could use toward the obituary at time of need. But if there was a big jump in pricing, then the family would be responsible for that difference. Funeral homes also use it sometimes. Again, if you come in and you plan a funeral, say it's $5,000, but you only have $1,500, you might go ahead and pay them the $1,500 and then set up a payment plan. But because you're not paying for the whole amount, there's not that whole amount in the bank drawing interest. So they won't guarantee the price because it's not going to get any gains. It's not going to gain the interest to help offset inflation. So, you know, as you're paying your $100 as it's available or every 3 months or whatever y'all agree on, it's slowly building, but you still haven't gotten up to the amount of your funeral. So they might not feel comfortable guaranteeing the price since you haven't paid for the whole amount. So those are two times that we see funeral homes use the non-guaranteed price. It's fine either way. The state doesn't have a preference over which way the funeral homes do it. It's really between the funeral home and the consumer on how they feel comfortable writing the contract.
Okay, we have another question. What if you have a pre-need contract in South Carolina but wind up moving out of state? Does the transfer to another pre-need funeral home transfer interstate as well?
It does, and we see this occasionally. We've dealt with, you know, transfers with our border states, North Carolina, Georgia, sometimes to Tennessee, but it could also, you know, you could move across country. Typically what we do in those circumstances is a lot of times the funeral home will call us about that because they're not sure how it works when you're transferring to a funeral home out of state. But typically one of us will usually contact the new funeral home itself and just verify that they are licensed in their own state. So, you know, we'll check that. And then once we know that they are licensed, we'll let our funeral home know, yeah, that's fine to go ahead and send them the information. And once it goes to the new state, then it would pick up under their laws. So if you transfer it to, say, a funeral home in Georgia, I would verify that the funeral home is licensed, but as soon as it transfers over, then the Georgia laws pick up and it becomes regulated by the new funeral home's laws.
I do not see any other questions in the box at the moment.
Scott, I'm gonna throw out a couple questions we're commonly asked, just real quick, and I'll give time if some other people have some questions that come to mind. On one of the slides, it was under "Is my money safe?" and Joni talked about that funeral homes that have a pre-need license are routinely inspected. Just wanted to expound a little bit on that. So every 2 years, as Joni mentioned, we're required by statute to go into those funeral homes that are licensed to sell pre-need. And the things that we're verifying, the funeral homes are required to keep monthly or quarterly statements in regards to all their pre-needs accounts, which the most updated balances. They're also required to keep ledgers, in-house ledgers that we can see as interest has grown or people have made payments, that type of information. That's also verified against their receipt books of what monies they've received. Also, if they're selling pre-need insurance, they're required to keep impact statements quarterly from the insurance company that they're a representative of that they're selling. So we're verifying all that information and what the current balance is. And then when a pre-need, as was mentioned in our slides, when a pre-need is sold, a contract is written and then it's filed with the department. This is one of the only industries that we regulate that are required to, every transaction they do, they're required to send the contract to us, to a copy of it to be held in-house. So we also run those reports against what the funeral home has as their list of active pre-needs. So I wanted to expound a little bit on that about the regulating and the oversight when it comes to pre-needs to give the consumer kind of an assurance of how that's also monitored. Another question we get is, and that we've gotten over the history since we've overseen pre-need contract, is does a guaranteed contract lock me into having to use the funeral home? We talked about it's transferable, but a consumer needs to realize that no, that's not a guaranteed contract that I have to go to that funeral home. It's a guaranteed price contract. So that's the other sometimes confusion, is that, oh, well, we don't want to do one because I don't want to, what if something, my mind changes and I want to move to another funeral home? You can, and we talked about that earlier, that there's a way to transfer. So it's, even though it's called guaranteed, it's just a guaranteed price contract. Another question we get from funeral homes, I talked a little bit about the number of licensed funeral homes in the state by LLR and the number of pre-need licensed funeral homes that are with us, and how that's a fractional number. Some questions we get from funeral homes that we make contact visits of, just to make a contact visit. They're unlicensed, and we ask, do you solicit or sell pre-need? Is they say, well, I don't want to have to take the class and pass the test. Well, that's strictly regarding selling pre-need insurance. To offer pre-need, your entity, your funeral home has to be licensed with us, and then you can offer just trust accounts. The second layer to that is if you then get with a pre-need insurance provider to sell, that's the part about the Department of Insurance requirement of the 40-hour, week-long class and taking a test. So there's some, if there's funeral homes on here and they've kind of, there's that misconception out there, or has in previous years, that we license the entity, and once you get a pre-need license, you can do trust accounts. It's just if you then are selling pre-need insurance, that's an individual pre-need insurance license that you have to get. So those are common questions that we've heard the number of years that we've been doing this. Are there any other questions that have arisen since we've been talking?
Not at this time.
All right. Joni, do you have any other questions or anything that maybe you've come across? If not, we'll kind of move on.
I don't think so. Again, if this is something, you know, as you're thinking about it, if a question comes up later, feel free to reach back out to us. We don't mind answering questions. You know, if you do have one, we're here. So if something else comes up and you think about it after we get off, feel free to reach back out.
We did have somebody just ask another question. So what if you use a different funeral home and they don't want to honor the contract as written?
And sometimes that will happen, and that's something to, you know, check on before you transfer it. If you do decide that you want to use a new funeral home and they won't honor the contract, the monies can just be applied toward the new contract. They would write a new contract on their contract with their name and stuff on it, and they would put their services, their merchandise, what they charge the money that you paid to the first funeral home would then just be applied toward that funeral. And if there was, money still owed, you could add to it. A lot of times funeral homes are, and I'm speaking for the industry here, when maybe I shouldn't, but typically I see that funeral homes are willing to honor pre-needs because they want to earn your business. So if you had it at ABC Funeral Home and now you want to transfer to XYZ, a lot of times XYZ is willing to do it just because they're trying to, earn your business. A lot of times funerals or families will use a certain funeral home. So for, multiple, for the whole family. So if the new funeral home is trying to earn your business, they may honor it. But if not, you can just apply that money toward the new funeral. And then again, if there's money left over, it would be refunded to the purchaser or to the estate of the beneficiary. And if there's money still owed, you could just make up the difference.
That looks like the last question for now.
All right. Well, I'll just kind of wrap that up real quick of just the different questions we have of just if you're uncertain when you go into a funeral home to do a pre-need, just verify that they're licensed. There should be a license hanging on the wall that's from the Department of Consumer Affairs. You're welcome to call us or look on our website, but we'll always answer your call, and you can verify that they're licensed to offer pre-need. And then as a consumer or a business, you're welcome to always, like Joni said, talk to us about anything that arises.